Hi everyone, I'm Rincey and this is Rincey Reads. Today I'm going to be talking about His Only Wife by Adzo Medie. This is a relatively new release and I wanted to read this just because the premise sounded really interesting and the way it was being pitched seemed really interesting, and I'm really glad that I read it because I really enjoyed it. This story takes place in Ghana and you are following this character named Afi, who is a seamstress basically. The story begins on her wedding day when she is getting married to a man who isn't even at her wedding. Basically, there is this woman who is kind of like the family's benefactor. She's been like very generous in giving them money and support, and she's even like her mother's boss and Afi's mother's boss and things like that. And so one day she comes to Afi's mother and proposes that Afi marries her son, one of her sons. And the reason why she wants Afi to marry her son is because her son is with this, I think it's Liberian woman, and they actually have like a child together and all of this stuff. And his mother wants her to basically marry him and then kind of like get him to end things with this other woman that the family just 100% does not approve of. And so the way this story begins is with Afi marrying this man that she's never met before, moving into one of his apartments. That's how wealthy this family is. And she's kind of like waiting for him to eventually show up and for her to finally like really be his wife. The assumption that Afi has, and I think something that's kind of implied through all of this, is that he will eventually leave this other woman and be Afi's husband, like fully. But obviously, like things are not that simple and things don't really go quite that smoothly. So yeah, this is like really fascinating family drama. It's being described as like comp to things like Crazy Rich Asians and kind of being like humorous in a similar way. And I have to say, like, I didn't really find this book very humorous. I found it like super engaging and super interesting, but I wouldn't say it was like a funny book. I think that Crazy Rich Asians comp kind of comes from Afi being a woman who grew up relatively poor in Ghana and then marrying into this extremely wealthy family and realizing there's like a whole lot that goes into being part of a wealthy family, both in terms of like familial obligations as well as like social obligations, and like how it is in the world once you are in this like next tier of life. So I think like that sort of comp then is relatively accurate, but it doesn't really give you like Crazy Rich Asians feels, or at least it didn't for me. And I think it's probably because the vast majority of this book, Afi is by herself and she's just like navigating this world and trying to figure out what to do. A big part of this story is just watching Afi grow as a human being, because she's relatively young. I think at the beginning of the story, there are no like real ages given, but she's probably like in her 20s and she's relatively inexperienced and naive about the world. She lives in a smaller town in Ghana and then she moves to the capital where things are obviously very, very different, but she's living again completely by herself in this apartment building that is like, you know, completely furnished and whatever, everything's provided for her. She has a driver, she has people who go out and buy groceries for her and do all of these things, but she is again completely alone and she doesn't even know really like who around her she can trust and confide in, because there is this whole aspect of her husband being with another woman. She doesn't really know like who's actually trustworthy, who will be her ally, her friend, versus someone who is just looking for gossip, who's actually on maybe the other woman's side, who is actually just like spying on things for her mother-in-law, all of that stuff. And so you see Afi navigating all of these different rules and conventions that she feels like she has to fall into. At the very beginning of the story, like I said, she's like relatively like naive and she doesn't really know what exactly is going on. And so she basically just knows like what her mother and mother-in-law have told her about what she needs to do as a wife. And so she feels like she needs to provide a meal for her husband all the time, and so she starts like cooking meals all the time, never knowing like if he's actually going to show up for them. And then like eventually he realizes what's going on and tells her like, don't cook for me unless I tell you that I'm actually coming home. But also like the roles that she's supposed to play, what she is and isn't supposed to say to him, and all of this stuff, and what she is and isn't supposed to allow, and all of this stuff. But also she has like this role that she's supposed to play where she is supposed to be, I guess, enticing enough, I don't really know what the right phrase is for it, to like lure him away and to her instead. And so there's like this really intriguing conflict that's created in this story through that, but it's all told solely through Afi's eyes. And so there's like a very limited scope in terms of like knowing what exactly is going on, which leads to some like really interesting results as the story continues. A lot of this book is about like social commentary and gender commentary and sort of like the social and gender norms that are expected of men and women and what's allowed of men but not of women and things along those lines, and like kind of this idea that like everyone or every guy has a wife at home that he like provides for and all of this stuff, but also has like mistresses and women on the side and stuff like that, and that's kind of like expected. And also the idea that like Afi should be grateful because her husband and his family provide like everything and so much more that she could ever want. After getting married, she has like so many more opportunities that she pursues that she probably wouldn't have been able to pursue if she hadn't got married to this man. And so there's this whole aspect of the story that's her wrestling with her life and whether or not she should be grateful or not about this situation, and whether expecting her husband to leave this woman is unreasonable or not and whatnot, and kind of like dealing with those conflicting emotions. And I think that like the way that the author explores all of those things is really, really well done. But I will say like this is a relatively short book, so I feel like some things go by really fast, and you do cover a number of years over the course of this book. So there are certain things that I would have loved to have seen like fleshed out more. You see a lot of growth happen with Afi as a character, and you see changes happen in the relationship, and you could say like it feels a little bit fast just because again it's a relatively short book. There is certain sections that are just sort of like you jump ahead in time and you just know that these things have happened. You don't really see that progress being done, but overall I feel like it was pretty well done. And I think like the most interesting part for me is kind of seeing the progression of Afi and to see like how she as a character changes over time. Not all of the changes are positive, but it is really interesting to see sort of like how she ends up changing based on her circumstances and her environment and things like that. And she even comments upon it one time, like being someone who like lives in a wealthy area in a really nice apartment, all of this stuff, how her perspective even has changed while being married and stuff like that. And so all of that is really fascinating, really well done. But overall, I found this to be like such a great engaging book. If you're someone who's like wants something kind of fast paced and I don't want to say fun, but it's just like a really compelling story, this would definitely be a really great book to pick up. I also feel like this would be a really great book to read with other people because I feel like people are going to have some really strong opinions about all of the characters in here. I think that like really the characters in here, including the side characters, are like very, very interesting, and it would be like fascinating to see even stories written from some of the other perspectives in here, because everyone leads such different lives, and so I can only imagine like what that must be like for them in this world that the author has created. So yeah, I really enjoyed this book a whole lot. I would give it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I definitely would recommend it. I think I was kind of like pleasantly surprised by this book because I would think I was expecting something more like fluffy, like more like a typical romantic novel or something like that. But this one has a lot of bite and commentary to it that I wasn't expecting, and it isn't a typical romance novel. So yeah, definitely recommend this book if you are interested in some contemporary fiction because this was very well done. So those are my thoughts on His Only Wife. Please leave a comment down below letting me know if you've read this book, what your thoughts were on it, or if you have any questions about the book, feel free to leave that down in the comment section as well. So yeah, that's all I have for now. Thanks for watching.